The small town of Ashwood was cloaked in a somber mood as the community gathered at the local crematorium to bid farewell to Margaret Hensley. She had been a beloved schoolteacher, known for her kindness and dedication to nurturing young minds. Her passing came suddenly, leaving everyone shocked and heartbroken. Though doctors claimed it was due to natural causes, there were whispers among the townsfolk that something about her death didn't feel right. The crematorium stood on the outskirts of town, an old brick building surrounded by towering oak trees. It wasn't a place people visited often, but today, it seemed even more unsettling than usual. Gray clouds hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the grounds. A chilly breeze swept through the air, rustling leaves and making those present shiver despite their heavy coats. Margaret's family sat closest to the furnace room where the ceremony would take place. Her son, Daniel, looked pale and distant, his hands clenched tightly together. He hadn't spoken much since his mother's passing, retreating into himself as grief consumed him. Beside him sat Sarah, Margaret's daughter-in-law, who tried her best to comfort him with gentle words and reassuring touches. But even she couldn't shake off the strange feeling that lingered in the air, a sense of unease that no one could quite explain. Behind them, friends and neighbors filed in quietly, exchanging soft murmurs as they found their seats. Some clutched tissues, while others held onto prayer books or rosaries. Everyone knew Margaret personally. She had touched so many lives during her years as a teacher. Yet amidst the sorrow there was an undercurrent of tension. Whispers spread like wildfire. Had Margaret really died of natural causes? Or was there something darker behind her sudden departure? Standing near the entrance was Mr. Calloway, the elderly caretaker of the crematorium. His wrinkled face bore a look of discomfort, his eyes darting nervously between the mourners and the closed door leading to the furnace room. He adjusted his tie repeatedly, a habit he only indulged in when anxious. Something about this day felt wrong to him, though. He couldn't put his finger on what exactly it was. Perhaps it was the way the wind howled outside, or maybe it was the silence inside the building. It was too heavy, too oppressive. As the priest began speaking, his voice echoed softly against the cold walls of the room. He spoke of Margaret's life, her generosity, and the warmth she brought to everyone around her. But even his comforting words couldn't dispel the growing sense of dread that loomed over the gathering. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at one another, furtively. Was it just the gloomy weather affecting their moods, or was there truly something ominous about this occasion? Toward the back of the room, an older woman named Mrs. Grayson gripped her cane tightly, her knuckles white from the effort. She had known Margaret longer than anyone else, having been her neighbor for decades. As the service continued, she leaned closer to her husband and whispered, "Something doesn't feel right here." Her husband nodded solemnly but said nothing. They both had felt it, the inexplicable chill that ran down their spines whenever they thought about Margaret's final moments. Despite the sadness hanging over the event, no one expected what would happen next. As the priest concluded his speech and signaled for the coffin to be moved toward the furnace, a collective breath seemed to catch in the throats of everyone present. The creaking sound of the wheels rolling across the floor filled the silence, each turn echoing louder than the last. And then, just as the coffin reached the threshold of the furnace room, the atmosphere shifted entirely. It started with a faint noise, a sound so subtle that most dismissed it as the wind or a trick of the mind. But as the seconds ticked by, the noise grew louder, more distinct. It was a sharp, piercing scream that seemed to come from nowhere, and yet, somehow, it felt like it was coming from everywhere all at once. The mourners froze, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Daniel shot up from his seat, his eyes wide with panic. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. No one answered. Instead, all eyes turned toward the coffin, now resting ominously close to the furnace. The scream had stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving behind an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of everyone's necks stand on end. Mr. Calloway stepped forward hesitantly, his hands trembling as he approached the coffin, Whatever doubts or fears he'd harbored earlier were now amplified tenfold. With hesitant movements, he reached out to inspect the coffin, unsure of what he might find. What none of them realized yet was that this was only the beginning of a mystery far deeper and darker than any of them could have imagined. Mr. Calloway hesitated, his trembling hands hovering just inches above the coffin. He glanced back at the crowd of mourners, their faces pale and frozen in shock. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the furnace behind him, its low rumble doing little to ease the tension in the room. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to act. If there was something wrong with the coffin, or worse with Margaret's body, it was his responsibility to find out. He carefully placed his hand on the cold metal handle of the coffin lid, feeling its icy surface bite into his skin. For a moment, he considered calling for help or delaying the cremation altogether. But before he could second-guess himself, curiosity, and perhaps a sense of duty, pushed him forward. With a shaky grip, he lifted the lid ever so slightly, peering inside. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Margaret lay still within the satin-lined interior, her hands folded neatly over her chest. Her face appeared peaceful, almost serene, as if she were merely sleeping. Relief washed over Mr. Calloway briefly. He had half expected to see something horrifying, though he couldn't have said what. But then, his eyes caught sight of something peculiar. A faint mist swirled around her face, rising slowly from her parted lips. It wasn't steam or condensation, it looked alive, twisting and curling like smoke caught in a breeze. "What is that?" whispered Mrs. Grayson, who had crept closer along with several others. Her voice cracked with fear, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. Everyone leaned in instinctively, trying to get a better look without daring to step too close. The mist grew thicker, swirling faster now, forming strange shapes that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. Daniel pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding wildly. "What are you doing?" he shouted at Mr. Calloway, his voice laced with panic. "Close it. Close it right now." His outburst startled the caretaker, who fumbled with the lid but managed to shut it firmly. The metallic click echoed loudly in the tense atmosphere, bringing a fleeting sense of closure but not relief. The priest, who had been standing silently near the furnace, finally spoke up. This cannot be explained by logic," he said, his voice unsteady. "We must proceed carefully. Perhaps we should delay the cremation until—" "Until when?" interrupted Sarah, Daniel's wife, her voice sharp with frustration. "Until someone tells us what's going on? Until we figure out why my mother-in-law screamed from inside a sealed coffin? What exactly do you think we're supposed to do? Here?" Her words hung heavy in the air, forcing everyone to confront the reality of the situation. They were dealing with something beyond their understanding, something that defied reason. Yet, despite their shared confusion and fear, no one wanted to leave the crematorium, not yet. There was an unspoken agreement among them. They needed answers, even if finding those answers meant facing the unknown. As the group debated what to do next, Mr. Calloway noticed something else odd. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly since the scream. Frost began forming on the edges of the coffin, spreading outward like icy tendrils reaching for warmth. People huddled closer together, rubbing their arms to ward off the sudden chill. Some muttered prayers under their breath, while others simply stared at the coffin in stunned disbelief. Margaret's son, Daniel, sank to his knees beside the coffin, tears streaming down his face. "Mom," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "Please, tell me what's happening." His grief transformed into desperation, his hands gripping the sides of the coffin as if willing it to respond. But there was no reply, only the oppressive silence that followed the scream. Mrs. Grayson shuffled forward again, leaning heavily on her cane. "There's something you all need to know," she said, her tone grave. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Margaret confided in me before she passed. She mentioned hearing voices At night, when she was alone, she said she heard whispers coming from nowhere. She thought she was losing her mind, but now... She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. The revelation sent ripples of unease through the crowd. Could it be possible that Margaret hadn't died of natural causes after all? Had whatever plagued her during her final days somehow followed her beyond death? The questions swirled in everyone's minds, unanswered and terrifying. Mr. Calloway broke the silence once more. "We can't ignore this," he said firmly, surprising even himself with his resolve. "Something is wrong here. Very wrong. We need to open the coffin again and examine her properly. Maybe there's a clue." His suggestion sparked immediate protests. "Are you insane?" cried one man, backing away from the coffin as if it might leap to life. "That thing isn't normal. You heard the scream. It came from inside." But Daniel surprised everyone by stepping forward. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil visible in his eyes. "She's my mother. If there's any chance of understanding what happened to her, I have to try." Reluctantly, the others nodded in agreement. Together, they gathered around the coffin, bracing themselves for whatever awaited them. As Mr. Calloway reached for the lid once more, the frost on its surface began to spread faster, creeping toward his fingers like a living thing. The air grew colder still, and the faint sound of whispering returned, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. With a deep breath, Mr. Calloway lifted the lid again, revealing Margaret's motionless form once more. This time, however, something was different. Her eyelids fluttered weakly as if struggling to open. And then, from somewhere deep within the coffin, a voice emerged. A single word spoken in a tone so chilling it froze everyone in place. "Help." The room erupted into chaos. The word "help" hung in the air like a ghostly echo, reverberating through the minds of everyone present. It wasn't Margaret's voice, not the one they remembered at least. This voice was raspy, strained, and filled with an anguish that sent shivers down their spines. For a moment, no one moved. They were paralyzed, their eyes locked on the coffin as if expecting it to come alive. Daniel was the first to break free from the trance. His hands shot forward, gripping the edges of the coffin as he leaned closer to his mother. "Mom? Mom, can you hear me?" He called out desperately, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. He reached for her hand, but before he could touch her, the frost on the coffin surged outward, spreading rapidly across the floor like icy veins. People stumbled backward, gasping at the unnatural phenomenon. Mrs. Grayson clutched her cane tightly, her knuckles white. "This isn't right," she muttered, shaking her head. "No one should speak after death. Not like this." Her words carried an eerie truth that resonated deeply with the others. Death was supposed to be final, a peaceful end to life's journey. But what they were witnessing defied every natural law they had ever known. Mr. Calloway, who had been standing closest to the coffin, suddenly recoiled as though burned. His face turned ashen, and he took several shaky steps back. "Something's moving inside," he stammered, pointing toward the satin lining within the coffin. Everyone froze again, their gazes darting between him and the coffin. Sure enough, there was a faint rustling sound, soft, almost imperceptible but undeniably there. Sarah, Daniel's wife, let out a choked sob. "What is happening? What's wrong with her?" she cried, clinging to Daniel's arm. Her fear was palpable, mirroring the terror building in everyone else's hearts. No one dared to answer her. They didn't know how. The priest stepped forward, hesitantly, clutching his prayer book tightly. Perhaps we are dealing with forces beyond our comprehension," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "There are things in this world, and beyond, that science cannot explain. Maybe Margaret needs our help to find peace." His suggestion sparked a mix of reactions. Some nodded cautiously, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Still, no one could deny the evidence before them. The scream, the frost, the whispers, and now the movement within the coffin. Whatever was happening, it was real, and it demanded attention. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. If Mom needs help, then we have to give it to her, he declared, his voice trembling but resolute. We can't just leave her like this. His words seemed to galvanize the group, even if only slightly. Slowly, they began to gather around, the coffin once more forming a loose circle as if drawing strength from each other's presence. As they watched, the rustling grew louder, more pronounced. The satin lining shifted, and then, to everyone's horror, Margaret's fingers twitched. Her hand, previously resting peacefully over her chest, began to rise slowly, as if reaching out for something, or someone. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by stunned silence. "Margaret," Mrs. Grayson whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Dear Lord, what has happened to you?" For a brief moment, hope flickered in Daniel's eyes. Could it be possible that his mother was still alive? Was this some kind of miracle? But as quickly as the thought came, it was extinguished when Margaret's mouth opened wide, wider than humanly possible, and another sound emerged. A low, guttural moan that sent chills racing down everyone's spines. The moan wasn't human. It was raw, primal, and utterly alien. It seemed to resonate not just in their ears but in their very bones, filling the room with an oppressive dread that made it hard to breathe. Frost continued to spread, climbing up the walls and coating the windows until the entire crematorium felt like an icy tomb. "We need to close the coffin," someone shouted, panic rising in their voice. Several people lunged forward, attempting to slam the lid shut, but the frost formed a barrier, freezing the edges of the coffin in place. It wouldn't budge. "No," Daniel yelled, pushing them away. "We can't lock her in there. She's trying to tell us something." "But what if she's not alone?" Mrs. Grayson countered, her voice barely above a whisper. All eyes turned to her, confusion etched on their faces. What if whatever's speaking through her isn't her? Her words struck a chord, sending a fresh wave of fear coursing through the group. If the voice wasn't Margaret's, then whose was it? And why had it chosen this moment to reveal itself? Before anyone could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted further. Their breaths came out in visible clouds, and the frost on the walls thickened into jagged icicles. Then, without warning, the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping, and chaotic as if countless voices were vying for attention. Among the cacophony, one phrase became clear. "Let me out." The command was delivered in Margaret's distorted voice, yet it carried an authority that silenced every person in the room. The coffin vibrated violently, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Whatever force had taken hold of Margaret was growing stronger and angrier. Daniel fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Mom," he choked out. "I don't know what's happening to you, but I'll fix it, I promise." But deep down, he knew this was no ordinary tragedy. This was something far darker, far older, and far more dangerous. The room was frozen, not just by the icy temperature, but by the sheer weight of fear that pressed down on everyone. Daniel knelt beside the violently shaking coffin, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. What had happened to his mother? Was she truly trapped somewhere beyond death, or was something else, something sinister, using her as a vessel? His heart ached with guilt and confusion, but more than anything he felt powerless. Mrs. Grayson, who had been standing quietly in the corner, suddenly stepped forward. Her cane clicked against the frost-covered floor as she moved closer to the "Cremation, we need to figure out what's causing this," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "If we don't act now, I fear whatever is inside that coffin will only grow stronger." Her words struck a chord. The others, though terrified, nodded reluctantly. They knew they couldn't simply stand by and watch as the situation spiraled further out of control. But where could they even begin? This wasn't something they could solve with logic or reason. It was beyond anything any of them had ever encountered. The priest cleared his throat nervously, clutching his prayer book tighter. "There are rituals," he began hesitantly, choosing his words carefully. "Prayers meant to guide lost souls to peace. Perhaps if we perform one, it might help Margaret, or whoever is speaking through her, find rest." His suggestion sparked both hope and skepticism. Sarah, Daniel's wife, frowned deeply. "You mean exorcism?" she asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Do you really think that's what this is? A demon possession?" "I didn't say that," the priest replied quickly, raising his hands defensively. "But there are forces in this world we cannot see, forces that sometimes interfere with the natural order. If Margaret is caught between life and death, perhaps these prayers can bridge the gap and free her." Daniel looked at him, desperation evident in his eyes. "Then do it," he urged. "Whatever it takes, just try. Please." The priest hesitated, glancing at the coffin warily. He had never performed such a ritual before, and the thought of confronting whatever lay within filled him with dread. Still, he couldn't turn away. Taking a deep breath, he opened his prayer book and began reciting a solemn invocation, his voice trembling but steady. As the Latin words echoed through the room, the atmosphere shifted. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a frenzy of voices that seemed to come from every direction. The frost on the walls crackled, spreading faster and thicker until the entire crematorium felt like an Arctic prison. The coffin shook violently, its metal frame groaning under the strain. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Grayson, gripping her cane tightly. "It's making it worse." The priest faltered, lowering the book. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the freezing cold. I don't know what else to do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. At that moment, Mr. Calloway spoke up, his tone unusually firm. "Maybe we're going about this all wrong," he said, stepping closer to the group. "This isn't just about Margaret anymore. Something brought her back, or kept her here, and we need to find out why." "But how?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising with frustration. "How do we fight something we can't even understand?" Mr. Calloway hesitated, then pointed toward Margaret's belongings, which had been placed on a small table near the entrance. Among them was a leather-bound journal, its pages worn and yellowed with age. "Margaret always carried that with her," he explained. "She used to write everything down, her thoughts, her fears, her dreams. Maybe there's something in there that can explain what's happening." Daniel's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. Without wasting another second, he rushed over to the table and grabbed the journal. Flipping it open, he scanned the pages frantically, searching for anything unusual. At first, the entries seemed ordinary. Reflections on her teaching career, notes about her students, musings on life. But as he turned to the final pages written in shaky handwriting, he found something chilling. "The voices," Daniel read aloud, his voice trembling. "They're getting louder. I hear them at night whispering my name. They tell me things. Secrets. Secrets I wish I'd never known." He paused, swallowing hard. "They say I'm special, that I have a purpose. But I don't want it. I just want them to stop." The room fell silent as the weight of Margaret's words sank in. Whatever she had uncovered, or unleashed, it had clearly consumed her. And now, it seemed determined to use her as a conduit. Mrs. Grayson leaned heavily on her cane, her expression grim. "Margaret mentioned hearing those voices to me," she confessed softly. "But I thought she was imagining things, maybe losing her mind. Now I realize she was telling the truth." "So what does it mean?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "What did she discover? And why is it still haunting her?" No one had an answer. But as they stood there, staring at the journal and the trembling coffin, one thing became clear. They needed to dig deeper into Margaret's past. Somewhere in her life, or perhaps in her family history, lay the key to understanding the unnatural force that had taken hold of her. And until they found it, they would remain trapped in this nightmare, unable to move forward. With renewed determination, Daniel closed the journal and tucked it under his arm. "We'll take this home," he said firmly. "We'll read every page, follow every clue. We owe it to Mom to figure this out." The others nodded in agreement, their fear tempered by a shared resolve. As they prepared to leave the crematorium, the frost began to recede slightly, as if sensing their intent. The whispers faded into silence once more, but no one believed. It was over. Not yet. Outside, the gray clouds parted briefly, allowing a sliver of sunlight to pierce through. It offered little comfort, however. They all knew the darkness was still with them, waiting patiently for its next move. Back at Daniel and Sarah's modest home, the group gathered around the dining table, the leather-bound journal lying open, in front of them like a relic from another world. The air was heavy with tension but also determination. They had no choice but to confront whatever secrets Margaret had left behind, if they hoped to save her soul, or even their own sanity. Daniel flipped through the pages carefully, his hands trembling as he read aloud. Most entries were mundane, reflections on daily life, thoughts about teaching, memories of family gatherings, observations about nature during her morning walks. But as they delved deeper into the journal, the tone shifted dramatically. The later entries grew darker, more fragmented, filled with cryptic phrases and disjointed thoughts. "I see things now," Daniel read, his voice shaky. "Things I shouldn't. See? Shadows moving where there should be none. Whispers calling my name when no one is there." He paused, glancing up at the others. She knew something was wrong long before she died. Sarah leaned forward, her brow furrowed. But what caused it? Was it stress, illness, or something else? Mrs. Grayson shook her head slowly. "It wasn't illness," she said firmly. "I've known Margaret for decades. She was strong, mentally and physically. Whatever this is, it didn't come from inside her. It came from outside." The priest nodded thoughtfully, his fingers tracing the edge of the journal. "Perhaps we're looking at this the wrong way," he suggested. "Maybe the key isn't just in these recent entries. Maybe we need to look further back, to her childhood, her family history. Sometimes these kinds of forces are tied to bloodlines, to events that happened generations ago." His words struck a chord with everyone. If the voices and whispers weren't random occurrences, then they might be connected to something far older than Margaret herself. Something buried deep within her past, and possibly her ancestors. Daniel turned the pages back to the beginning of the journal, searching for clues. Near the earliest entries, he found a faded photograph tucked between two pages. It depicted a young Margaret standing beside an elderly woman who bore a striking resemblance to her. The caption beneath the photo read, "With Grandma Eleanor, summer of 1962. "Who's Eleanor?" Sarah asked, leaning closer to examine the picture. "Mrs." Grayson's eyes widened in recognition. "That's Margaret's grandmother," she explained. "She passed away years ago, but people used to say strange things about her. Rumors of seances, curses, rituals. Folks claimed she dabbled in things best left alone." A chill ran down everyone's spines. Could Eleanor's actions or mistakes have set this chain of events in motion? Had some unresolved force been waiting all these years only to resurface through Margaret? "We need to find out more about her," Daniel said firmly, closing the journal. "If Grandma Eleanor opened a door to whatever this is, then maybe we can close it." Mr. Calloway, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up hesitantly. "There's someone who might know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. All eyes turned to him, urging him to continue. "Old Mr. Hargrove. He runs the local library and has lived here longer than anyone. He collects stories about Ashwood's history, the ones most folks don't want to talk about." Without hesitation, the group agreed to visit him immediately. As they drove through the dimly lit streets of Ashwood, the weight of their mission pressed heavily on them. Each passing moment felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something they couldn't yet comprehend. When they arrived at the library, a quaint brick building with ivy creeping up its walls, they found Mr. Hargrove sitting behind a cluttered desk, surrounded by stacks of dusty books and yellowed newspapers, his glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose as he peered over them, studying the unexpected visitors. "What brings you here so late?" he asked, his voice gravelly but kind. Daniel stepped forward, holding out the journal and the photograph. "We need your help," he said earnestly. "We think something unnatural is happening, and it might be tied to Margaret's grandmother, Eleanor. Do you know anything about her?" Mr. Hargrove's expression darkened. For a long moment he said nothing, simply staring at the items in Daniel's hands. Then with a sigh he gestured for them to sit. Eleanor Hensley was a complicated woman, he began slowly. Some called her gifted, others said she was cursed. She believed she could speak to the dead, and she wasn't afraid to cross boundaries to do it. He rose from his chair and shuffled to a nearby shelf, pulling down a thick leather-bound book. Opening it, he revealed sketches of ancient symbols and handwritten notes detailing rituals meant to summon spirits. This belonged to Eleanor, he explained. After she died, her belongings were donated here. Few dared to touch them. As they studied the book, a realization dawned on them. Eleanor hadn't just communicated with spirits, she had bound them. And if those bindings had weakened over time, it was possible that one of those spirits had latched onto Margaret, using her as a vessel to return to the mortal world. "This is it," Daniel whispered, clutching the book tightly. "This is how we fix this." But as they prepared to leave, Mr. Hargrove stopped them with a grave warning. "Be careful," he cautioned. "Forces like these don't take kindly to being challenged. You may think you're helping Margaret, but you could be putting yourselves in grave danger." Their resolve wavered briefly, but they knew there was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The group returned to Daniel. In Sarah's home, the ancient book clutched tightly in Daniel's arms. It felt heavier than it should have, as though its weight carried more than just paper and ink. Everyone gathered around the dining table once again, their faces etched, with a mix of determination and dread. They knew what they had to do next. Attempt a ritual to sever whatever connection bound Margaret to the spirit world. But none of them truly understood the risks involved. Mr. Hargrove's warning echoed in their minds. Forces like these don't take kindly to being challenged. Yet they couldn't abandon Margaret or themselves to this torment. The whispers from the crematorium still lingered in their memories, a haunting reminder that whatever force was at play wasn't finished with them yet. Daniel opened the book carefully, his hands trembling slightly. Inside were detailed instructions for rituals meant to communicate with or banish spirits. Symbols drawn in faded ink adorned the margins, accompanied by cryptic phrases written in Latin. He flipped through the pages until he found one titled Liberatio Animae, the liberation of the soul. According to the text, this ritual required specific items: salt, candles, herbs, and something personal belonging to the person seeking release. In this case, Margaret's journal. Sarah stood up abruptly, her voice steady despite the fear visible in her eyes. "We need to prepare," she said firmly. "If we're going to do this, we can't afford any mistakes." Everyone sprang into action. Mr. Calloway volunteered to fetch supplies from his home. He kept a stash of candles and herbs for emergencies at the crematorium. Mrs. Grayson offered to help organize the space, clearing the living room floor and arranging chairs in a circle. The priest stayed behind to guide Daniel through the ritual, ensuring they interpreted the instructions correctly. As they worked, an uneasy silence settled over the house. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass as if trying to break in. Shadows danced across the walls, cast by flickering candlelight. Every creak of the floorboards made them jump, their nerves stretched taut like violin strings. When everything was ready, they gathered in the center of the room. A large circle had been drawn on the floor using salt, its edges glowing faintly under the soft light of the candles. Inside the circle lay Margaret's journal, open to the final page where her desperate plea had been scrawled. Around it, bundles of dried sage and lavender were placed strategically, their earthy scent filling the air. The priest took a deep breath, holding his prayer book close. "We must remain calm and focused," he reminded them. "Whatever happens, do not break the circle. Do not speak unless instructed." Daniel nodded, his jaw clenched tightly. He stepped into the circle, followed by Sarah, who held his hand, for support. The others formed a protective ring around them, standing shoulder to shoulder. Each person held a lit candle, its flame casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the icy tension in the room. The priest began reciting the incantation, his voice low but commanding. The Latin words rolled off his tongue like a melody, each syllable resonating deeply within the confines of the small house. As he spoke, the candle's flames grew brighter, flickering wildly as though stirred by an invisible breeze. The atmosphere shifted, becoming heavier, almost suffocating. Suddenly, the whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, overlapping in chaotic waves. They seemed to come from everywhere, echoing off the walls and seeping into their minds. Some of the voices sounded familiar, while others were distorted and alien. Fear gripped the group, but they stood their ground, clinging to the hope that the ritual would work. Then, without warning, the temperature plummeted. Frost crept along the edges of the circle, spreading outward like icy tendrils. The journal in the center began to tremble, its pages flipping violently as if caught in a gale. Daniel tightened his grip on Sarah's hand, his knuckles white. "Keep going," Mrs. Grayson urged, her voice strained. "Don't stop." The priest continued chanting, his voice growing louder to drown out the cacophony of whispers. Just as the frost reached the outer edge of the circle, a figure materialized. Above the journal, a translucent form resembling Margaret. Her face was pale, her expression pained, and her eyes wide with terror. But something was wrong. Her mouth moved, yet no sound came out. "Mom?" Daniel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Is that really you?" Before anyone could react, the apparition's features twisted grotesquely. Its eyes turned black and its lips curled into a sinister smile. A guttural laugh erupted from its throat, shaking the very foundation of the house. This wasn't Margaret. It was something wearing her likeness, something malevolent. "You cannot free her," the entity roared, its voice reverberating through the room. "She belongs to me now." Panic surged through the group, but the priest raised his hands, shouting the final lines of the incantation. The candles flared brilliantly, their light blinding. For a moment, the room was bathed in pure white radiance, and when it faded, the apparition was gone. But the silence that followed was deafening. Had they succeeded, or had they only angered the spirit further? Only time would tell. The room was eerily quiet after the ritual. The candles had burned down to stubs, their flames extinguished in the aftermath of the blinding light. Frost still clung to the edges of the salt circle, but it no longer spread further. It seemed contained, almost frozen in place. Everyone stood motionless, their breath shallow as they waited for any sign that the entity might return. Daniel knelt beside the journal, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch its worn cover. For a moment, he feared it would crumble, into dust or burst into flames, but instead, it felt warm beneath his fingertips, a stark contrast to the icy chill that lingered in the air. He opened it hesitantly, flipping through the pages. To his relief, the frantic scribbles from before were gone, replaced by blank sheets. It was as though the book had been cleansed, purged of whatever dark force had tainted it. "Do you think we did it?" Sarah asked softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was tentative, filled with both hope and uncertainty. No one answered immediately. They all looked at each other, searching for reassurance in their tired eyes. Finally, the priest stepped forward, his expression weary but calm. "I believe so," he said slowly. "The ritual was meant to sever the connection between Margaret and the spirit. If nothing else, we've weakened its hold." Mrs. Grayson nodded solemnly. "That thing, the spirit, was furious when it left. It didn't want to let go. But I think—" She paused, her gaze drifting toward the journal. "I think Margaret is finally free." Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes as he hugged the journal to his chest. "Free," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "But where is she now? Is she at peace?" The priest placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We can only pray that she has found rest," he said. "Whatever pain she endured during her final days and beyond is over now. That's what matters most." As the weight of everything they had experienced settled over them, the group began cleaning up the remnants of the ritual. Mr. Calloway carefully swept away the salt circle, while Mrs. Grayson gathered the herbs and candles. Sarah helped Daniel put the ancient book back into its protective wrapping, ensuring it wouldn't fall into the wrong hands again. Outside, dawn broke over Ashwood, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The storm clouds had dissipated, leaving behind a crisp, clear morning. It was as if the world itself was exhaling, a collective sigh of relief after the chaos of the night. Later that day, the group returned to the crematorium, not out of obligation, but because they felt it was the right thing to do. This time, there was no unease in the air, no oppressive cold or whispers echoing through the halls. The atmosphere was peaceful, almost serene. As the coffin was placed inside the furnace once more, Daniel took a step forward. Holding back tears, he whispered, "Goodbye, Mom. I love you." His voice cracked, but there was clarity in his words, a sense of closure that had eluded him until now. When the furnace door closed and the process began, there were no interruptions, no screams, no frost, no unnatural phenomena. Only the steady hum of machinery and the quiet sobs of those who loved Margaret deeply. In the days that followed, life in Ashwood slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such an ordeal. The townsfolk spoke less about Margaret's mysterious death and more about her kindness, her laughter, and the lives she had touched. The crematorium remained open, but Mr. Calloway made sure to keep Eleanor's book safely locked away in his private quarters, vowing never to let anyone use it again. For Daniel and Sarah, healing came gradually. They visited Margaret's grave, often leaving flowers and sharing stories about her life. Each visit brought them a little closer to accepting her passing, not as a tragedy, but as a chapter closed with love and courage. One evening, as Daniel sat alone in his study, he noticed something odd. On the desk lay Margaret's journal, which he thought he had stored away. Curious, he opened it and found a single sentence written in neat handwriting. "Thank you." A smile tugged at the corners of his lips despite the tears streaming down his face. He knew then without a doubt that Margaret was truly at peace. And though the memory of that terrifying night would stay with them forever, the group found solace in knowing they had done everything they could to set Margaret free. In doing so, they had also freed themselves from fear, from doubt, and from the shadows of the past. Sometimes even in the darkest moments there is light. And sometimes saying goodbye isn't the end. It's a new beginning.